we recently had discussed this topic of distraction. And we had spent some time talking about how distraction, or the lack of focus, if you will, is that one of the major issues facing men today. And, I shared a little bit about my own personal journey over the last few months and how I got distracted, right? I got to this place where I had lost focus on what was really important. And I don't think that this is all just a personal thing with me. I actually am very confident that this is an issue facing all men, all of us, every single day. And you see, the dangerous thing about distraction is when it's in our lives, many times we don't recognize it. It's subtle, right? It's camouflaged. It's very quiet. But when it rears its ugly head is when it's almost too late, right? When it becomes obvious, it's almost too late. And for me personally, I had a mentor who helped me kind of process through this and made me aware of the lack of guardrails in my life. And we define guardrails as this. I said this in the last podcast. I said it's boundaries set up in your life that keep you on the path that God's designed you to be on. Now, before I kind of dive deeper into some of the examples of guardrails, and when I say examples, I'm going to give you examples of the ones that I've established in my life, because that's what's relevant to me and that's what I want to share. And my prayer is that this is not about me, but it's about encouraging you, to hear another man's guardrails, to say, hey, I need to do something like this, or hey, I can modify that, or whatever it might be. But before we dive too deep into that, I want to kind of go here just for a moment. As men, we cannot set up effective guardrails in our lives until we've established what's important to us. It's our priorities, our values, our goals. And not all. Now, I think here's the trick with when I say those three things: priorities, values, goals. These three things fall under the same umbrella, but yet they're each unique in their own right. And I'm not going to spend too much time here, but if you want to dive deeper into this, I will say this. Connect with me, email me. I'm going to give you my email address. It's Garret, Garret, at menofiron.org. And I can kind of point you to some resources that might help you to be able to establish these things. But I want to keep this high level for today. And the thought is that priorities can change in a man's life, but values don't. Now, let me give an example. If a man has a health scare, or they wake up one day, they look in the mirror and they finally realize that, they've packed on a few more pounds than they would like, then all of a sudden what happens is their health and fitness should become a higher priority. It may not have been, but hey, it's a new priority. But the values in which we live by should rarely, if ever, change. And when you look at goals are a little deeper into the weeds. These are the specific, the measurable, the realistic, the time-bound action items that we actually want to accomplish. Now, I want to go back to guardrails here, because, again, these are the boundaries that we put into place that are going to allow us to stay on the path to actually be the men that God expects each of us to be. We stay true to our priorities. We live in a way where we're modeling out these values that are important to us, and we are actually accomplishing the goals that we've set. That's what happens when we've got guardrails. And a very few percentage of men take the time to sit and process this stuff. Why? Well, because it's freaking hard. And it's easier to wake up and to go to work and come home and be mediocre and just get by. So I want to get just practical here with these last couple of minutes. For me, as I sat down after this conversation with my wife and my mentor, I had to look at my priorities and say, well, I know what they are in my head, but let's really evaluate. Okay, I know I haven't been living out my priorities the way that I should. So for me, I had to write them down again. Number one is my relationship with God. That's important to me. It's the most critical thing in my life. It's the foundation to my life. It's the foundation from which everything else in my life can be built upon. So it's first. I'm going to make that my first priority. Number two is my relationship with my wife. Number 3 is the relationship with my kids. Now, this is what was new for me this time around, was that 4th, I put myself. And that might sound very selfish, but I'm going to explain why that is here in just a bit, is that I was not taking care of myself physically. I wasn't getting the rest I needed to get, wasn't taking care of my health. I wasn't getting my workouts in the way I needed to get to. I wasn't taking care of Garret. And when I don't take care of Garret, it's hard to take care of anybody else. And so the 5th thing then on there is Men of Iron, and there's things below that, but for sake of time, I'm not going to share those things. So those are my priorities in that order. Now, the values in which I live by, this was a 6-month project that my wife and I worked on together. It took us 6 months to get, hey, what's most important to us? What are the values we want to live as a family, as a couple? What are the values we want to instill into our children? And we came up with this acronym of LIGHT. And I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but it's loving is number 1, intentional, generous, hardworking, and thankful. So when I'm striving toward the things that God wants me to accomplish, and I'm living life day in and day out, whether that's as a man, as a husband, as a father, as a co-worker, whatever it might be, as a neighbor, as an active citizen in society, I'm going to make sure that everything I do, I'm living out these values. And if I'm not living out those values, then I don't have the proper guardrails in place. And then finally, there's the goals. And I set my goals up, and we do this here at Men of Iron in the framework of the 5 F's: faith, family, friends, fitness, and finances. But you see, when we get distracted, guys, the first thing that we often notice is that we're not accomplishing our goals. These are the most obvious things. But as we dive deeper into things, we start to realize that it's not just the goals we're not accomplishing. We're not accomplishing the goals because we're not living out our values, which are at the center. And then that leads us to the fact that, okay, I'm not reaching my goals. I'm not living out my values. Well, why is that? It was because we're not following our priorities. And our priorities often are flip-flopped, and that's the distraction. This is where distraction sets in, and this is why focus is so critical as men. And so this is when we have to stop. This is when we have to shut off the noise, and we have to get really, really honest about our boundaries and our guardrails. And for me, it took me to shut off my phone. It took me to go out on a walk for a couple of hours, sit by the water, sit in the woods, get out in nature, get outside in that fresh air, and to just get new perspective. And so what is it that we have to do? That's the question I want you guys to wrestle with today, is what is it that you have to do to get to a place where you start to evaluate the priorities, the values, and the goals in your life? For some of you, you're going to have to do what maybe I did, shut everything off. For some of you might need to get away for a weekend. Others of you might be able to do this in a couple hours, but for me, it was a half a day. And so I want you to think about your priorities, think about your values, think about your goals. Are you intentional in these areas? Have you written these things out? Because guardrails will direct and protect, okay? But they won't get you to where God wants you to go. Does that make sense? I want you to hear that. Guardrails direct and protect, but they will not get you to where God wants you to go or where he designs for you to go. I recently heard a pastor share this. He said God's protection comes when we seek and apply the wisdom that he's provided to us through the Bible. And so my challenge today is that you would seek that wisdom out that God provides to us. Don't let your priorities and values and goals be yours, but let them be God's. And I love what Romans 12:1-2 says. It says this: "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." Now listen to this, verse 2. "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, his pleasing, and perfect will." So guys, the bottom line is that if you're trying to establish priorities, if you're trying to establish values, and you're trying to establish goals, you've got to seek God's wisdom in this area. And it is only then that you can start to say, okay, well, what are the guardrails or the boundaries that I need to put in place to make sure that I'm living these things out? So I want to share just a few examples of some guardrails that I really do believe God just kind of downloaded on me as I really started to reestablish some priorities and values and goals. And these are very, very important. And I think that it's whatever you need to do, this is what you need to wrestle with. I'm not going to give you the formula for figuring it out, because I think that's just that. I'd be giving you something. I think you need to wrestle with this and kind of figure this out on our own. But for me, it was number one boundary, number one guardrail for me was no Men of Iron commitments before 8:30 a.m. I need that morning time to make sure that I'm getting my God time, right, where I'm reading the Bible, I'm journaling, I'm spending time in prayer. But it's also a time where I now have flexibility to work out before I start my day. And so that is guardrail number one. No Men of Iron commitments before 8:30 a.m. Prior to that, I was taking meetings in the morning, breakfast meetings. I was missing time with family in the morning. I was not taking care of myself. I was getting up and rushing out the door, and my whole day and my soul just felt rushed. Number two guardrail that I've put in place is that when I get home, my cell phone goes on a charger and I don't look at it. And so the other thing that I'm doing with that, the other guardrail, which is number three, is I'm using that do not disturb feature. Once 7 o'clock hits at night, it goes on do not disturb from 7 p.m. till 7:30 a.m. And that means I don't get any notifications, I don't get emails, I don't get texts, I don't get any of that stuff. And so again, that's more so that I can be present with my family, be present with myself, be present with God. Guardrail number three is my cell phone. When my wife goes to bed, sometimes she goes to bed before I do. The cell phone goes in the bedroom with her. That way I'm not up at night getting distracted and scrolling through the phone, and the temptations aren't hitting in. We all know the dangers of that. I actually put a fourth guardrail in place, which was I took all social media off all of my devices. So I'm just like, I'm off Instagram, I'm off Facebook. Well, why was that? Well, first off, it was a distraction. Number two, I got sick of reading everyone's bullcrap. And the media just like sucked me into everything that was going on in our world right now. And I was just getting consumed by it all. And so I just took it all off. And so that was guardrail. The fifth guardrail for me was I'm going to be home for family dinners 4 nights a week. You know, so much of what we do here with Men of Iron does require some evening commitments, and I'm involved in other things like coaching wrestling. And, you know, for me, it was, hey, I need to make sure that guardrail's in place. We're going to have a sit-down dinner as a family 4 nights a week. And then finally, this last guardrail, which was a priority of mine this year, but I had gotten away from it, and that was that I'm going to date my wife once a month. And so that's a guardrail. That's going to keep me on path to making sure that my wife is a priority. So guys, I don't know what your guardrails are, but just know that it's going to be hard to establish guardrails until you list out your priorities, you establish your values, and you write out your goals. So that's my challenge to all of us. Guys, God bless you, and we'll talk to you soon.